The CO now put us into line astern, dropping to 2,000 feet, and back we went into the soup. Just then, he told me later, he lost his map temporarily irretrievably into the bottom of the cockpit, quite a habit with us. Suddenly we broke out into some sort of sketchy visibility, and below us, too darned close for comfort, was a transporter bridge. "Hans, you're a North Country man. Where the hell is that bridge? Quick!" I remembered that there were only 2 such bridges in the kingdom, and the other was at Middlesbrough. We couldn't be there. "That's Runcorn, sir. We're all right. Just follow the river and we'll come to Warrington." "Where the hell is Runcorn? Next door to Warrington. Press on!" It was still raining when we landed at Stretton. Johnny Baker parked beside me and stood up in his cockpit, looking down at the rating who was bending down to put chocks under his wheels. He described, as only a Canadian can swear when he really means business, how he saw the recent performance and the CO didn't emerge too well from the monologue. When the rating stood up and showed herself to be a highly decorative girl in bell-bottoms, Johnny was appalled and stumbled through some attempt at an apology. He had just met his first wren. Eric Rogers made it safely to a forced landing on the beach outside the Royal Liverpool Golf Course at Hoylake. Steve Starkey, dislodged from the formation somewhere over Lime Street Station, was an Ellesmere port boy and had no trouble whatsoever in making his own way through the country lanes, as it were, to Stretton. Reggie Shaw never did remember where he had lost us or where he had been since the parting of the ways. At long last he saw an airfield and promptly landed. He taxied over to the tower where a young RAF rating ran down the outside stairs to greet him. "Where am I?" "Shaw from the cockpit." "Where are you?" said the boy, fairly open-mouthed. He came from Manchester and had never heard of anyone being lost within 10 miles of that northern metropolis. "You're at Ringway, of course." Reg was a South London boy, and Ringway, now Manchester Airport, might just as well have been in enemy territory. "Where's Ringway?" he retorted, rather testily. "Where's Ringway? It's Manchester, of course, that's where." "Then where's Stretton?" "Where's Stretton? Stretton's over there," said the lad, holding out his arm at full stretch and pointing. "Good lad," said Reg. "Now get off the wing, keep pointing towards Stretton and don't move until I fly over you." So Shaw brought his Corsair to Stretton. In the first week of December 1943, we paraded at Stretton's village church to see Keith Munnock take the vows of holy matrimony. It was a marvellous occasion. Neil Brynildson was elected to be best man and undertook to ensure that Keith remained 100% sober for his arrival at the altar rail. To his great credit, this was achieved, though where the difficulty came in I never really appreciated, for Munnock was certainly not the type to blot his escutcheon, but only at Brynildson's own expense. Whether he downed 2 at a time to compensate for Keith's non-participation, or was bolstering up his own courage to face the coming ordeal of appearing so prominently in the public eye, I shall never know. Whatever the reason, there is no doubt that my No. 2 was hardly at his best. Apart from some breathtaking lists to port and starboard, he remained fairly vertical during the service, and finally made a rather erratic course to the vestry, there to perjure himself by signing the register to the effect that he had been fully cognizant as to what had been going on. A fair number of wives and sweethearts foregathered at the Victoria Hotel, Stockton Heath, there to spend with us such time as remained before the summons came. 1 or 2 modifications to the aircraft were carried out. The new VHF radio was fitted. Small scoops appeared on both sides of and below the fuselage, designed to disperse pockets of carbon monoxide which, said the boffins, were inclined to collect in the fuselage. It was thought that, because the exhaust stubs were flush with the engine cowlings, they were not throwing the expelled gases clear of the forward end of the fuselage. Influenced to a certain degree by stories, which had preceded us across the Atlantic, of death and destruction on carrier decks, Illustrious sent down her batsman Johnny Hastings to give us a good workout on the everlasting ADDLs. We did little else during our short stay at Stretton. Johnny was, and still is, good fun and very charming, and was soon popular with the pilots. An ex-fighter boy himself, He knew most of the answers and was a man we felt we could trust to do his highly responsible job. Our new fighter wing leader, Dickie Cork, was also sent down from the Clyde, probably to assess the quality of his two new squadrons, 1830 and 1833. It had been decided to increase the complement of the squadrons to 14. To achieve this, 1831 was disbanded, and we now acquired Monteith, our shot-of-the-year friend, Ken Seebeck, a New Zealander, Alan Booth, a Cheshire boy, Alan Vickers from Southport, and Stan Buchan, who hailed from Dundee. Monteith was responsible for providing the only incident on the airfield. Doing a touchdown for Johnny Hastings one afternoon in a bit of a crosswind, he clipped a wingtip on the concrete runway at the moment of opening up again to do another circuit. His lack of experience, and probably a bit of panic, now proved his undoing. Instead of cutting his throttle and making the best of a bad job, in which event he would have got away with a shaking up and a new wingtip, he pressed on. The great Corsair, under full throttle, careered across the grass, bouncing on the end of the port wing, which took a very poor view of such treatment. It so happened that the NAFI van had just rolled up to the squadron with tea and scones. The CO and I were standing at the office window, cups in hand, when we were astonished to see a Corsair fly past, literally, the window, busily engaged in completing a slow roll. As we looked at one another, unbelieving, there came the most monumental crash from our left. Monty had hit an earth revetment near the office, which had caned his aircraft onto one side, breaking off a wing at the root. When we erupted from the office and ran across the field to a sizable gap in the hedge, we saw the machine reclining on its belly, smoking gently amid the turnips. No wings, no prop, no undercarriage. Monty was clambering out. He looked somewhat vague. The destruction among the turnips was stupendous. "What happened?" he asked, stumbling away with his parachute waggling behind him like a monstrous bustle. He was still saying it an hour later, sitting in an office chair to which we had led him. He didn't have a scratch. In fact, Johnny Hastings was infinitely more affected. But then, bless him, Johnny worried about all of us. Keith Munnock could spend only a short time with his bride, for all too soon it was goodbye to the girls. We assured them that something would happen to make it possible to see them before we sailed from the Clyde. I must confess that, for my part, I was relying largely on past experience in arriving at this assumption. So one murky, foggy night with visibility down to 10 yards, dimmed headlights, ice on the roads, and a totally inadequate supply of filthy language, we ferried our ratings, our aircraft spares, bags and hammocks from the airfield to a train in Warrington Station. What with the weather, the usual last-minute chaos, and one thing and another, this operation took us the best part of the night. The next morning we flew off, in lovely weather, over Blackpool Tower, Morecambe Bay, St. Bees Head. In the distance I saw my honeymoon hotel, the Abbot's Court, where the incomparable Harry Brown rig held sway, to Machrihanish on the Mull of Kintyre. Machrihanish was known to the branch under several names, the most respectable of which was Nissen City, for obvious reasons. The most common, and only semi-respectable at that, was Macrifferkin. I should imagine that a posting to this outpost of the Empire in high summer was worth a king's ransom, for the surrounding country is beautiful beyond belief. More than that, to fly on exercises in good weather over the Firth of Clyde, Kilbrennan Sound and the Sound of Jura can have been a privilege granted only to a few. But in late autumn or winter, Machrihanish was a penance bordering upon a sentence. The weather could be, and nearly always was, foul. Our average evening's entertainment seemed to consist of putting extra lashings on all aircraft exposed to the fury of the gales, while we ourselves were being soaked by driving rain. Campbelltown, 6 miles away, was a typical small Scottish town, though somewhat dour and lamentably lacking in the amenities which might otherwise have transformed it into the Dodge City of the North. One of the redeeming features of Machrihanish for me was that its captain was C.L. Howe, who had been our kindly and tolerant father at Dequila. He was the same reserved, imperturbable soul, and went out of his way to smooth out any difficulties that arose during our short stay. Of necessity, Macrifferkin became its own Dodge City. The excitement certainly revved up a bit after nightfall. If one could hear above the steady roar of the great west winds, there were sounds of revelry on all sides with many a girlish giggle. It was said, naughty, fickle rumour, that wrens posted to the station were hand-picked erotic types whose underwear was exclusively fitted with Robinson's patent disengaging gear. I find it difficult to believe, but you take things as you find them. I flew for only 1 day before my night of driving to and from Warrington Station caught up with me. The man with the red stripe said bronchitis, and within half an hour I was in hospital at Southend, at the very end of the Mull. After 4 days there, I recovered from whatever had hit me and returned to the station. Within 15 minutes, Dickie Cork had me airborne. For the best part of a fortnight, apart from interruptions caused by December gales, we flew exercises and ADLs. During this time, Illustrious was exercising in the Firth for the benefit of the crew at the commencement of a new commission, as well as her 2 Barracuda squadrons, 810 and 847. One wild, blustery evening, the CO burst into the billiards room, accompanied by a trumpeting blast of cold air courtesy of Greenland, followed by a liberal spattering of sleet as an encore. With a high-pitched yell, he froze the shot I was about to make, demanding to know where the bloody hell the duty boy was, and would Hanson get the hell out of it and find him. I left the pot black to my partner Eric Rogers, who stood little more chance than I of making it, and went in search of Ken, that most damned elusive pimpernel. After visiting all probable haunts, I finally arrived at his cabin, the skylight of which showed it to be in darkness. Still, it was worth a try. He was in bed. When I turned on the light, he sat up like a startled gazelle, looking most demure in white shirt, stiff collar, black tie and all. I was embarking on my opening remarks when she popped up on the far side of the bed, a pretty little thing with wavy blonde hair. Her neat white blouse and black tie were obviously her copulating attire. I started again. Ken didn't wait for my closing nunc dimittis. With commendable alacrity, he was out from the sheets, donning trousers, shoes, jacket and duffel coat with practised skill. "What about her? Can you get her back to the Renery without getting caught? It's the rattle for the 3 of us if you don't make it." I nodded. "You wouldn't?" "Promise. I'm a pommy, I know, but not that kind. Now belt off for God's sake. Charlie Orange wants your blood." I looked at the girl. 18 if she was a day. "Come on, kid, let's be getting you back." She slid smoothly to the modest little runner of carpet at the bedside, naked from the waist downwards, and didn't give a damn. I went to the wardrobe and found Ken's no-one trousers. With a bit of luck, they would fit her reasonably well, for Ken was on the short side. By this time she had put on pants and stockings. I gave her the trousers, dolled her up in Ken's raincoat and spare cap, and we were off. Fortunately for us, the wind was blowing force 7 or 8. The few bodies we met were treading warily in almost pitch darkness, bowing to the gale. We reached the Renery safely and without detection. I was the worried one. She couldn't have cared less. We succeeded in completing such flying as we did at Machrihanish without any prangs. I had an emergency landing on the field when, during one of my regular scans of the dials, something each pilot carries out, consciously or unconsciously, every few minutes, I saw the needle of the hydraulic pressure gauge fall hair-raisingly to 0. I headed back to the field, blowing down the undercarriage with CO2 as I flew my circuit. With such fluid as remained in the system, I was able to get about 20 degrees of flap and put her down in a pretty fast landing. When the fitter was repairing the damage, he called me to the hangar to show me the root of the trouble. He held out to me a short, highly polished steel shaft, about 3 inches long, one end finished in a pinion gear, the other in an uneven fracture. "That's your trouble, sir. The drive from the power unit to the hydraulic pump, buggered." Funny that something as solid and straightforward as that should go. "It's called metal fatigue, sir. Something about molecules and crystallization. Read about it somewhere." Metal fatigue. A new one to me, yet an expression which in post-war years was to become a household word and bring death and destruction to many a good aircraft. HMS Illustrious, we weren't thinking of death and destruction as 5 or 6 of us walked across the Macrihanish tarmac to our corsairs in the bright, thin November sunshine. Terence Shaw, our genial commander, operations, intercepted me to ask me to deliver a letter aboard the carrier. His nonchalant assumption that I should arrive in one piece, capable of handing his letter to the commander, took a little of the wobble out of my knees. We took off to the west, Dickie immediately going into a wide left-hand turn to enable us to join up on him. I latched on to his port wing as we swept low over Campbelltown and out over the Firth. After a minute or two, across the fuselage of Cork's aircraft, I saw her. That great, beautiful ship, serene on a silver sea, a faint wisp of smoke above her island, and only the suspicion of a feather of wake astern to believe her apparent immobility. Dickie put us into starboard echelon. I lifted slightly and skidded over him with the rudder to fall into position on No. 2's starboard wing. After a sweeping turn to port, losing speed and altitude, we flew low up the ship's starboard side. Down undercarriage, down hook. About a mile ahead of the ship, Dickie broke to port, establishing the landing pattern. Seconds later, I followed No. 2, carefully taking up an interval on him, a practice which in a few short months would become second nature. Now we were flying downwind, locking the safety harness, locking open the hood, increasing pitch, lowering flaps, first to 10 degrees, then to 20. Now I was abeam of the stern of the ship. Turn 180 degrees to port, full flaps. Already Johnny was signalling for me. Roger, as you go, a shade faster, OK. Now come down, 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 damn you. Cut! I chopped back the throttle, held the stick steady as a rock. 3 seconds later, then I was on the wire. My body lunged forward against the harness with the deceleration. I was down. A red-capped director of the flight deck party waved me back with both hands. I released the brakes to allow the wind to blow me back a couple of feet so that the arrestor wire could be disengaged. Up hook, up flaps and taxi forward over the crash barriers. I jumped to the deck, 3.5 inches of armour plating. The air was loud with tannoy noise. Up there on my left, as I walked down the flight deck, was the great island, and the whole ship, alive with men in a variety of rigs, fairly hummed with activity. It was one of the great moments of my life, but it hadn't all been as rosy. Whilst I had been loafing in hospital for 4 or 5 days, Illustrious had been suffering the onslaughts of corsairs in their first attempts at deck landing. There had been far too many prangs, and one of them had been fatal. Brian Fiddes, Colorado of 1830 Squadron, despite his experience, had made a bad approach to the deck, and at the last minute had been given a wave-off to go round again. In manoeuvring a shade too violently to avoid hitting the island, he had clipped the port wingtip on the deck and had crashed over the port side into the sea. Nothing had survived. He and his aircraft had sunk like a stone. Accordingly, Captain Cunliffe had decided that more deck landing training was required, particularly in the matter of the approach pattern, and this had been done aboard an escort carrier, Ravager. Mike Tritton, lately the CO of 1834 Squadron and another very experienced pilot, was brought to the ship to replace the unlucky Fiddes. It should be stated here and now that the trouble with the Corsair Mark I was its built-in bounce. The undercarriage legs had oleo shock absorbers, air on top of oil. As the wheel took the weight of landing, the shock was transmitted to the oil, which in turn compressed the air. Unfortunately, the air expanded again all too quickly and too forcibly. The oleo leg immediately extended again, and the aircraft leapt into the air like a jackrabbit. If the pilot didn't catch a wire on his first contact with the deck, the odds were that he would finish up in the barrier. This happened to far too many pilots, and how you fared in the barriers was sheer conjecture. Some boys were burned to death, some, as I have said, were thrown over the side, others didn't even need an aspirin. It was all a matter of luck, but the matter of luck had to be eliminated, and Chance Vaught of Stratford, Connecticut, eventually came up with the answer. At the top of the oleo leg, an air valve was fitted. As the air was compressed by the oil, it escaped comparatively slowly through the valve, which, when the aircraft next took off and allowed the legs to elongate by the sheer weight of the wheels, sucked in more air in readiness for the next landing. The expulsion of the air took the bounce out of the oleos, and the wheels remained firmly on the deck. The problem was solved, but the Navy would lose lives and aircraft before it was proved how essential the modification was. The Mark II version, supplied to us when we reached Ceylon, incorporated the modification, together with a new and altogether splendid hood. To round off the matter of the Mark II, it might be added that a third modification was incorporated, that of water injection. For those interested in technicalities, the equipment was surprisingly modest and uncomplicated. It consisted of 2 small tanks of water under the engine cowling, containing sufficient water to give 5 minutes of full-bore running. The water was atomized and blown in at the carburation stage and had the effect of speeding up the atomization of the petrol-air mixture. You may have noticed that your car engine runs twice as briskly and sweetly on a drizzly, humid evening. The water injection produced similarly efficient running. The throttle quadrant was fitted at its fully opened end with a micro switch, protected across the quadrant groove by a piece of wire. To actuate water injection, the pilot, already flying at full throttle, merely had to hit the throttle lever hard with the palm of his hand. The wire snapped and the lever actuated the micro switch. The result was startling. The aircraft leapt forward with an immediate jump in speed of 35 to 40 knots. It was nothing short of miraculous. Illustrious wasn't merely an aircraft carrier. She was a legend, a ship which, in her short life, had already made history. Built by Vickers Armstrong at Barrow-in-Furness, she was launched on April 5, 1939, commissioned on April 16, 1940, and joined the fleet at Spithead 6 weeks later. She was a war baby. By the time we first arrived, by various means, she had seen a lot of war. She had fought her way through the Mediterranean with convoys for Malta and Egypt. She had taken the lion's share in the destruction of the Italian fleet at Taranto. She had gallantly withstood all that the Luftwaffe's U-87 Stukas could throw at her off Pantelleria on January 10, 1941, suffering incredible damage. She had struggled into Malta only to endure more attacks and suffer more damage at the hands of the dive bombers on the 16th and 19th of that month. After a refit in America, she had re-entered the conflict by providing air cover and attack for the invasion of Madagascar, and had given offshore support at the bloody landings at Salerno in 1943. Her motto, set in golden letters beneath the 3 brazen trumpets, ran Vox non incerta. She had already spoken in no uncertain tones. Now she had corsairs to keep the shouting going. This story is about flying from carriers, and it must be of help to some readers if I digress long enough to give a brief description of the ship, one of 3 of her class. The others were victorious and formidable. She had a nominal displacement of 23,000 tons, although it was popularly believed that additions and modifications had brought this to something nearer 30,000 tons. 3 propellers, driven by turbines, each developing 37,000 GP, thrust her through the water at 31 knots. The centre propeller was situated directly forward of the rudder, whose action was thereby greatly enhanced. She could turn on a sixpence. The overall length was 740 feet, with a maximum flight deck width of 95 feet. She was at once a mighty warship, a floating airfield and a seaborne anti-aircraft artillery regiment. 1,800 officers and men lived within her steel walls. Her great hangar, immediately below the flight deck, ran practically the length of the ship. There were 2 lifts, one forward, the other aft, which conveyed aircraft with wings folded to and from the flight deck. At the height of our commission, we carried 36 fighters and 16 bombers, 52 in all. At an earlier stage, when the Corsair squadrons were limited to 14 aircraft each, 21 Avengers had been accommodated. A great trial and tribulation to us was a permanent deck park of 14 aircraft, rendered necessary because of the lack of hangar space. These had to be shuttled back and forth along the deck, according to whether we were taking off or landing on. Alongside and above the hangar were squadron offices, stores and workshops. To operate aircraft, the flight deck was equipped with 8 arrestor wires, strong steel hawsers stretched at intervals laterally across the deck. At each end they disappeared round pulleys through the armour-plated deck into the hangar, where they were wound round great spools on which tension, under hydraulic pressure of varying strength according to the physical weight of aircraft being operated, could be imposed. As a wire was engaged by the aircraft's arrestor hook, so the self-centering wire was pulled from the spools, decelerating the aircraft to a standstill. The G-force exerted on the pilot was between 2 and 3, depending upon which wire was engaged. Some 60 feet forward of the centre of the deck were 2 safety barriers, a euphemistic term which fooled nobody. To us they were crash barriers. These consisted of hinged steel stanchions at both sides of the deck, which were raised or lowered to allow for the passage of aircraft across them. They were connected by 2 steel hawsers of enormous strength, about 3 feet apart, and they themselves were linked together by 3 or 4 vertical hawsers, like a huge net. These hawsers, too, were capable of being stretched, though only slightly, under hydraulic tension. 6-ton aircraft at 70 knots appeared to go through no one barrier like a knife through butter, but it must have taken some of the way off them, for no 2 always brought them up solid. Forward on the port side was the hydraulic catapult, capable of launching an aircraft to flying speed within a matter of 100 feet. On the starboard side of the deck, amidships, was the great island, which was at once the controller of the ship and the aircraft control tower. One up from deck level was the fighter direction office, from which radar and radio information was transmitted to aircraft, and from which aircraft were directed on courses to intercept the enemy. One deck up from there was the compass platform, known in circles other than naval as the bridge. Here stood the captain, the officer of the watch, the chief yeoman of signals, and, in his own chart room at the after end, the navigator. On the port side a sliding door led out to a small fore and aft bridge, from which commander, flying, wings, controlled all aircraft in and around the ship. Above this level was a flat containing small cabins for senior officers when at sea, and above that again was the Admiral's bridge. Abaft these positions were the Air Operations Room, which also served as the Air Crew's Ready Room, the Signal Bridge and the Air Defence Position. There was, too, an unused area, remarkable indeed in a warship, where space is invariably used to the last square millimetre. No one knew what, if anything, had been forgotten, but the fact remains that it was put to very good use. For this was Goopher's Gallery. It was the grandstand, like Liverpool's Cop. Here gathered all those bodies whose pleasure or masochistic agony it was to watch aircraft landing. Here would collect officers and ratings off duty, those who should have been on duty and weren't, visitors and genuine connoisseurs. All mustered here to watch the pilots dicing with death. This is no exaggeration. Most of the goofers, as the spectators were known, would learn in the next year or 2 how tragically true that was. The ship's main defence consisted of 16 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns. They could be used against air or surface targets. They were housed in 4 groups at each corner of the flight deck, arranged in twin turrets in each group. 3 groups were manned by naval gunners, the 4th, X turret, traditionally by Royal Marines. Short-range AA weapons were scattered around quite liberally, in the gangways running down each side of the flight deck, known as the nets, and around and on the island. There were 40 mm Bofors guns in single and double mountings, 20 mm Oerlikon cannons similarly arranged, and multiple pom-poms, which were rather old hat by 1943. Overall, on top of the island, blossomed a great complex of radar and radio aerials. She was quite a ship. The ratings of both ship's company and squadrons were divided, for leave and shore liberty purposes, into port and starboard watches, and these in turn were subdivided into first and second parts of port and starboard. Liberty could, therefore, be granted to 1, 2, or 3 parts as occasion warranted. Where duties were concerned, the ship's company, already divided into divisions, seamen, stokers, signalmen, and so on, was again divided into 3 watches, red, white, and blue. Confusing though it may seem, each rating was a member of 2 watches, one for leave and liberty purposes, the other for duties in the ship. The three-watch system embraced most sections of the ship's personnel. Watch-keeping officers who, in their spell of duty, controlled the sailing of the ship and supervision of her machinery. The seaman branch, engine and boiler room staff, telegraphists and signallers, and engineering and electrical staff. When the ship was at cruising stations, she sailed under normal watch-keeping routine. Certain operations, however, called for more specialised activities. Entering or leaving harbour, refuelling at sea, or close manoeuvring alongside another ship brought the navigator up to con the ship and the coxswain to the wheel. Cable parties were required on the cable deck and special seaboats crews for anchoring and mooring to or casting off from buoys. Action stations, of course, closed up every officer and man to his appointed position. The accommodation ladders leading from the depths of the ship at each corner to the hangar and flight deck levels utilised wells, whose main purpose was to provide for the hoisting of ammunition to the 4.5-inch guns. At action stations, therefore, these ladders were removed and the wells reverted to their main purpose. Personnel had no alternative but to climb up and down vertical ladders fixed to the ship's side inside the wells, a form of exercise which, with the dubious benefit of dim emergency lighting, could be highly diverting. Living quarters in the ship were, surprisingly, not cramped, despite the fact that she was carrying 1,800 officers and men, 500 more than her designed complement. The ratings, and the Royal Marines in their barracks, lived on the mess decks, open spaces of varying lengths and some 30 feet wide, divided into messes by banks of metal lockers which provided accommodation for the sailors' clothing and personal belongings. Each mess, the focal point of which was a wooden table and benches, assiduously scrubbed to unbelievable cleanliness, constituted home for 12 to 14 sailors. Life hadn't altered much since the days of Nelson. Here they ate, read, played cards and uckers, Ludo to you, wrote their letters home, discussed, argued, and occasionally fought. In colder and temperate climates here, too, they slept, with their hammocks slung from strong hooks fitted into the deckhead. Ventilation varied according to the situation of the mess decks and cabins. All scuttles and portholes below hangar level were closed at sea, and only a very few senior officers were fortunate enough to breathe fresh air. The vast majority of us seemed to thrive remarkably well on forced ventilation. In the airless and windless expanses of the Indian Ocean, most of us, officers and ratings alike, found space to accommodate a camp bed in a passage or a deck open to the fresh air where we could sleep without being stifled. Feeding was still on the general messing principle. Each mess provided 2 cooks of the day, working in rotation. At each mealtime, these 2 lads galloped off to the galley and presented the tally for their particular mess. In exchange, they drew meals for the number of men constituting their mess. This food they then brought back to their mess at the double, for loitering, with a consequent cooling off of a hot meal, was unpardonable. They served it with a skill born of practice under the sharp scrutiny of their messmates. Afterwards they washed the crockery and cutlery, and cleaned and rubbed down table and benches in readiness for the next meal. Tomorrow it would be somebody else's turn. The quality of the food was as good as the catering officers and galley staff could conjure up under greatly varying circumstances. The subsistence allowance provided by the Navy covered basic needs from the ship's supply officer together with additional items, up to a certain limit, from the NAFI's canteen manager. Any mess overdrawing from the canteen manager was subsequently charged with the excess, which was duly met from a mess fund accumulated by weekly contributions from its members. The officers lived in comparative luxury. Lieutenant commanders and above occupied single cabins, the smallest of which was some 12 feet by 7 feet. Junior officers lived 2 to a cabin, with 1 bunk above the other. All cabins contained a good wardrobe, adequate drawer space, a small desk and a wash basin. We lived in 4 communal spaces: the wardroom, off which was a small gun room for the use of midshipmen, a dining mess containing 3 long mahogany tables and chairs, and a warrant officers' mess, which provided both dining and leisure space. The officers of ship's company and squadrons numbered about 180, and warrant officers some 30 or 40. Food was on similar lines to that provided for the ratings. The officers paid monthly mess bills, which met the cost of food provided over and above the subsistence allowance allotted by the Navy. Ratings were traditionally entitled to a daily issue of rum at 11:50 every morning, under the supervision of the officer of the day. The men, however, could elect not to accept the issue, in which case they became entitled to 3d per day in lieu, paid quarterly. The officers' wardroom included a bar providing drinks at duty-free prices. Gin, for instance, at 2d per tot, whiskey and brandy 3d. Beer was most expensive at 6d. An officer's wine bill was limited to a certain monthly figure according to his rank, and the commander, always well informed on wardroom goings-on, had fairly harsh words for anyone overstepping the mark. An officer foolish enough to disregard a warning could find his wine bill stopped completely. The ship's and the squadron's complements included a number of officers' stewards who served in the officers' mess and carried out certain duties for them, such as shoe cleaning, making of beds, and keeping cabins clean and tidy. In addition to their normal pay, they were usually fortunate enough to receive from their officers an additional monthly payment by private arrangement. Although the ship possessed a laundry, the manner in which it operated was flexible, to say the least. Most ratings, with a deal of pride in their appearance, and most of them had, preferred to wash and iron their own clothing. Some ratings formed themselves into small firms and contracted to launder for other ratings or officers. A number of stewards laundered for their own officers. The versatility of naval ratings never failed to provide volunteers to cut hair or repair shoes. Modest tailoring jobs, too, could be carried out without any apparent difficulty. The sailors' hobbies could provide everything we needed: models, stage scenery, cigarette lighters, boxing rings, even toys to be sent home at Christmas. There is very little that 1,800 men can't do when they really try. In between days of exercising in the Firth of Clyde, we lay by night at anchor off Greenock, and rumours raged through the ship like forest fires. The two short-priced favourites were the Far East, not too well received, and Norway to attack the Tirpitz, anchored in a northern fjord, most popular. When we took on board a consignment of pith helmets and other tropical gear, we unanimously decided that their lordships were trying to pull bags of wool over our eyes, so it was to be Norway. Fully confident, I phoned Kathleen. "Don't worry, darling," I said. "We'll be back in a fortnight, just you see. Then I'll give you a ring. Who knows? We may get a few days' leave." My next letter to her was posted in Ceylon. Somewhere around 0745 on December 30th, I awoke to find my cabin in near darkness. Although the porthole was wide open, not a glimmer of daylight was to be seen. How odd! I knelt on my bunk and stuck my head out of the port. There, moored within a few yards of us, was the towering cliff of Queen Mary's stern. She had arrived during the night from yet another Atlantic crossing, and her unbelievable bulk was completely obscuring such meagre daylight as a December morning in the Clyde can afford. In the late afternoon we left Greenock, with Indefatigable lying at anchor in the stream, and made our way slowly and easily down to the tail of the bank, where we found a vast amount of naval and merchant shipping, including the carrier Unicorn, moored and anchored. We picked up our moorings and spent the evening putting extra lashings on the aircraft on deck, for rough weather was forecast for the middle and morning watches. At 21:15 that evening we slipped our moorings and passed through the Clyde boom. By 10 o'clock the following morning we were off the coast of Northern Ireland, in company with the Unicorn, 3 destroyers and 7 frigates. It was a miserable, dark December day, one of those which never really achieves daylight. Suddenly, out of the gloom to the southeast, signal flashes appeared. 15 minutes later we could discern the vague shapes of Queen Elizabeth, Valiant and Renown. They were pushing along in a big swell, and mountainous seas were crashing over their bows, cascading green water as far as B Turret. This was another moment to remember. How privileged to see such a sight. Mr. Haig, our master gunner, was standing beside me on the flight deck. He scorned aircraft with all the contempt he could muster, and steadfastly maintained his Whale Island precept that the 15-inch gun was the answer to every problem. "Aye, take a good look at 'em, lad," he said with a sigh of resignation. "If things go the way they seem with these flying machines and all, they could well be the last you will see." How right he was. I was glad I saw them on that dismal December day, as they appeared like wraiths out of the murk, three of the last of the big-gun ships of a navy now long forgotten. Our fleet pressed on southwards in gloomy, damp and cheerless weather. Grey, scudding clouds from the southwest maintained an unbroken ceiling, merging so precisely with a bustling sea which came at us in 20-foot rollers that it was impossible at times to discern a horizon. For the first 24 hours in open sea, some of us suffered from headaches and interminable yawning, sure precursors of seasickness. However, the leisurely motion of our great ship was so modest compared with that of our escorting destroyers and frigates, whose rolling hulls at times completely disappeared in the troughs, leaving only their mastheads and funnel tops visible, that by the next morning we were back to maximum vim and vigour and in full possession of our sea legs. In fact, at no time during the commission can I recall any of us fully succumbing to seasickness, though for the first day at sea, following a protracted spell ashore, we generally found ourselves suffering from the slight symptoms I have described. Heading south, the captain and commander, flying, decided that the corsairs should do no flying. The wintry weather of the North Atlantic was hardly the stuff in which to blood pilots who were still barely conversant with their aircraft, and who certainly had little confidence to cope with deck landing without suffering a sudden rush of blood to the head. The barracudas, on the other hand, were kept busy flying searches ahead of the fleet. One of these, returning to the carrier in the gloom of the late afternoon, had to ditch because of engine trouble, and its pilot, Morgan, was killed. I am amazed at the naivete of the entry in my illegal diary. Our first fatality, and the last, I hope. And what a hope. Within 2 days of that entry, I was awakened by 2 loud explosions, which proved to be depth charges from a barracuda whose engine had cut out as it went over the bows on takeoff. Sub-Lieutenant Walwork, his navigator and air gunner were all killed. 847 Squadron was having a rough time. A day's sailing on a southeasterly course brought us closer to land, and sometime in the middle of the night of January 5, 1944, we slipped through the Straits of Gibraltar into the different climatic world of the Mediterranean. Revelling in the unaccustomed warmth of January sunshine, I was standing on the flight deck one fine morning with Johnny Hastings, amused by some of our young men ragging one another. "Happy crowd, Hans," said John, "full of beans, and it's good to see." He nodded towards the sea, bustling past us at 18 knots. "I wonder how many of 'em will still be with us when we pass that bloody wave again." I laughed at him. "Don't be so bloody morbid, John. We'll all come back." He shook his head. "Remember, I've been here before, and I know. No, don't bother looking at them. There's no way of telling which ones. Just remember what I said, then you won't be too surprised." When we started flying again, it came as no surprise when things happened. Reggie Shaw knocked off his port wheel against a 4.5-inch gun and nearly killed Johnny, who was batting for us that morning. Miraculously, he managed to get his corsair into the air again without further mishap, and the ship gave him a course to steer for Maison Blanche airfield at Algiers. For some reason or other he failed to find it. He can't have been trying. After all, it was somewhere in Africa. After a bit of flapping around, he eventually belly-landed in a ploughed field, much to the consternation of the oxen and the dusky gentleman in attendance upon the plough. A barracuda flew to Maison Blanche. He found it all right. Navigators made all the difference, and picked him up. Somewhere off Mersa Matruh we came under simulated attack from RAF bullfighters to give us an exciting hour defending against them. In the early evening, off Alexandria, we were caught with our pants down when a German reconnaissance Ju-88 flew very high and fast over the fleet. I cannot now remember if our radar boys had been asleep or if some blind spot in signal reception had caused us to fail to locate him. The fact remains that he was overhead when wings scrambled the standby Corsair flight. Tragically, too quickly for our young man Monteith. In his rush to become airborne, he failed to lock his wings properly in the spread position, with the tragic result that, when he retracted his undercarriage as he passed over the destroyer screen, His wings folded and the aircraft plunged into the sea. He was only 20 and had become engaged, whilst at Stretton, to a charming young girl from his native Glasgow, who in that short time had captured all our hearts. It was a sad way to go. The ship proceeded without a halt through Port Said, the Suez Canal and Port Tawfiq into the Red Sea, where the heat lived up to its traditional ferocity. In mid-January we refuelled at Aden and headed out across the Indian Ocean. There would be no more flying until we reached Ceylon. Our wing leader, Dickie Cork, had laid on an exhaustive training programme, which made it essential that all aircraft should be on top line by the time we reached Trincomalee. The weather was extremely hot as we sailed southeast, especially for the ratings working in the hangar, where the temperature reached astronomical heights. As far as aircraft maintenance was concerned, it was naturally the hangar where there was most activity. In temperate latitudes, this armour-plated box, capable of holding 30-odd aircraft, was a pleasant enough workshop for the boys. In the tropics, it was hell upon earth. In a daytime temperature of anything up to 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit, the slightest movement produced a stream of perspiration. When an aircraft was flown regularly without mishap, its servicing was a straightforward, uncomplicated procedure. Every 30 hours it underwent an ever-increasingly rigorous overhaul culminating, if it lasted long enough, in a truly major one, which was tantamount to taking the whole thing apart and rebuilding it. It was also subjected to a daily check: tyre pressures, oil, hydraulic and air pressures, the correct functioning of ignition, instruments, radio and guns. If an aircrew was fortunate and their aircraft was in the right place at the right time, this daily check could conveniently be carried out on the flight deck. If they were not so lucky, however, the daily check had to be done in the hangar, that ill-lit, unbelievably noisy, unbearably hot dungeon where aircraft were lashed down, cheek by jowl, surrounded by straining, swearing mechanics clad only in a pair of shorts, wringing wet from perspiration, and gym shoes. Here they toiled, fuming at obstinate nuts, red-hot pipes and sparking plugs, and with the roll or pitch of the vessel calling constantly for a change of balance. Their hands never ceased to clear sweat from their eyes, and within 10 minutes their faces were covered in greasy filth and grime, rendering them almost unrecognisable. They were great chaps. One of a sailor's God-given rights is that which moves him to moan like the clappers at anybody or anything at any given moment, and these lads were no exception. But when called upon to pull out all the stops, they never failed us. There were times when the state of serviceability called them to slog it out in the hangar until the early hours of the morning. Yet I found them the next day, after only 2 or 3 hours' sleep, still moaning but with the hint of a smile beneath the grime, cheerful enough to say, "You'll find her okay, sir. No fear." Over 30 years later, I still owe my life to them. On the way out east, however, I wasn't exactly crying for them, for, as squadron maintenance officer, I was spending most of my time down in the hangar with them. At moments when I began to see mirages of ice cubes, I thought of days in Miami when Jim Pettigrew and I would emerge from a swimming pool to reach for a heavily iced rum and coke and ruminate on the hardships of war. My diary brought me back to reality. Another miserable day on maintenance. I feel tired out, as though the sight of that steaming, noisy hangar and the poor sweating devils working there will make me scream. Obviously, I was feeling very sorry for myself on January 26, 1944. The next day seems to have brought no improvement. Again, the entry is full of moans, grousing about the lack of cooperation from younger officers, and even going so far as to add mutinously, "The CO has done damn all this week." The mystic East so far certainly held no allure for me. First brushes with the enemy, our fighter wing leader in Illustrious was Lieutenant Commander A. R.J. Cork, DSO, DSC, RN, one of the great fighter pilots of the Fleet Air Arm, who had established an enviable reputation for himself. He had been seconded to the RAF during the Battle of Britain, and had flown with Douglas Bader. He had earned his DSO in fierce fighting over Malta convoys. He was also very good-looking and, in addition to shooting down a number of Luftwaffe and Italian pilots, had a lot of very satisfied girls to his credit. Dicky, I am sure, could have submerged us for evermore in flying stories had he felt so inclined. Yet despite his fine record, he wasn't a line shooter. Persuading him to open up on his exploits was like extracting a very obstinate molar, and great perseverance was called for. He did unbend one evening to hold us spellbound with an account of a daylight raid carried out by the U.S. Army Air Corps flying fortresses over an engineering works on the outskirts of Paris. The bombers were escorted by RAF Spitfires, including one flown by Cork. As usual, the German reaction was violent. Hordes of Messerschmitts rose to meet the threat, and the escort fighters were soon busily engaged. Too many, unfortunately, were led astray by the Luftwaffe and became involved in dogfights far away from the bombers. Those who had remained faithful to the B-17S found the going rough, so much so that the strike leader, a brigadier general flying the lead B-17, seized up the situation and broadcast to the fighters, "Hey, it's getting rough out there, fellas. Come on beneath us and stay out of the cold." They did as they were ordered. Cork said that the magnificent protection given, 10.5-inch guns from each flying fortress, was more than enough to keep the Bf-109S at bay whilst they enjoyed a breather. As soon as we were installed on the airfield at Trincomalee, he set us to work in earnest. We were roused from our beds while it was still dark, and by the crack of dawn we were out to the west coast of Ceylon, low-flying or practicing varied forms of formation flying. Then back for breakfast. For the first time we used our Corsairs as true fighters, throwing them round the sky, diving, climbing and turning to the outside limits. Dicky set squadron against squadron, and our dogfights seemed to fill the sky above China Bay. It was all highly exhilarating. What is more, our fighters now became a part of us, no longer a machine we were pushing about the sky. What was it like to fly a Corsair? It is no easy matter to describe it to someone who has never handled a fast aircraft, who has never known the thrill of three-dimensional high speed. Once tasted, that thrill remains with a pilot for the rest of his life. He climbs up on the high wing of the Corsair and lowers himself into the cockpit. The seat is a concave bowl of steel, designed to fit a packed parachute on which he sits. Between his backside and the parachute itself is a one-man dinghy, carefully stowed into a canvas case and attached to the parachute harness by a webbing lanyard. He straps himself first into the parachute harness, then into the safety harness. Now he dons his helmet and goggles and connects the RT lead and oxygen pipe. He's ready to start up. In front and to either side are ranged controls, levers, switches, dials, in all about 110 of them. He goes through his check-off list, or as our tame satirist Steve Starkey so neatly parodied it, check-off list. Magneto switches off. Control locks off, and check too that the rudder, elevators and ailerons are all turning the right way in response to movement of the controls. They have been known to have been reversed, with dire consequences. The wing lock lever is in neutral and the manual lock engaged. Tail wheel unlocked. The rain cover to the pitot head, the long spear-like projection from the end of the wing which operates the airspeed indicator, has been removed. The propeller control is in fully fine pitch. The angle of attack of the blades on the air is adjustable hydraulically. Fully fine pitch, offering least resistance to the air, gives maximum horsepower and is always used for takeoff. Once in flight, the coarser the angle, the lower the speed, the less wear and tear on the engine and the more economical its petrol consumption. Consumption, as a matter of interest, is about 60 gallons per hour at cruising speed and no less than 100 at operational speeds. Mixture control to full rich, to give the engine plenty of petrol to get her started. Elevator and aileron trimming tabs in neutral. 6 degrees of right rudder trim. At maximum horsepower, the engine torque is enormous and will try to tear the aircraft round to port. The pilot's own strength on the rudder pedal would be insufficient to resist that force, and the trimming tabs help him to overcome it. Cooling gills round the front of the big radial engine, oil coolers and intercoolers open. Petrol cock turned onto the main tank. This large container, holding 350 gallons, is surrounded by self-sealing material, and is positioned immediately in front of the cockpit, behind the engine. All this sounds quite a handful. In fact, it took only a few seconds. Now the pilot confirms to the fitter, standing to one side below him, that the magneto switches are off. The fitter grasps the propeller blade nearest to him and rotates it once or twice the wrong way, blowing out. Tough going, this, against the compression of 18 cylinders. Now he moves back and looks towards the pilot, who turns on the master electrical switch, rendering all systems alive. He gives the priming switch 2 or 3 short but decisive squirts, injecting a shot of neat petrol into the cylinders. Again he looks to his fitter, who signals to him that no one is standing within range of the great propeller. The pilot turns the magneto switches to on and presses the starter switch, firing the Kaufmann starter, which ignites a slowly expanding gas to hit the pistons under enormous pressure. The starter has a deep-throated tiger's cough. It jerks the propeller into life, backfires once, then settles into the comforting roar which signifies a good, clean, fire-free start. He moves the mixture control to auto-rich and advances the throttle to give 500 revs per minute on the RPM indicator. He leaves it there until the oil pressure gauge awakens and climbs to normal. Whilst waiting, he has another look around. Hydraulic pressure is normal. Oil temperature is rising to normal. The blind-flying artificial horizon is dancing around slightly, showing that it, too, is awake and healthy. He switches on the radio, and the crackling and unintelligible natter from miles away tells him that the set is functioning satisfactorily. At last, the oil temperature and pressure gauges show normal. He opens up the throttle steadily to 1,000 revs and, keeping an eye on the rev counter, turns off one of the magneto switches. The revs drop by 50. He switches back to both. A pause, then he turns off the other. Now the drop is only 30. Both are acceptable, for anything up to a loss of 100 is safe. Everything is okay for him to move. He throttles back and crosses and recrosses his hands before his face. The fitter and rigger nip below the wing and behind the lethal propeller to pull away the wheel chocks. The fitter gives a thumbs-up sign. The pilot advances the throttle a little and taxis out to the downwind end of the airfield runway. He makes his final turn towards the runway, which stretches away to the left, disappearing into the haze. He stops and looks towards the control tower, a steady red on the Aldis lamp. He looks up to the right. A barracuda, fairly reminiscent of an airborne section of the 4th bridge, is coming in to land. It looks as though it should have Christmas presents dangling from its wings. It thumps into the runway, its wheels leaving a spurt of blue smoke. Now the Corsair pilot closes the cooling gills. He locks his safety harness to hold him tightly against the armoured back of the seat. Then a glance at the tower. He gets a rat-tatting of a green light on the Aldis, as though to say, "Come on, for Christ's sake, get on with it." The Corsair rumbles out to the centre of the runway. He trundles a yard or two to get the tail wheel lined up, then locks it. Now, the author at Sawfley Field, Pensacola. N3N3S in the background. Sub-Lieutenant A, later Lieutenant Commander A, Elsie Wart, DSC, RNVR, Dequila, 1942. The author aboard HMS Trumpeter, returning from the USA in October 1943, Imperial War Museum, training at Pensacola with 4 New Zealanders. Left to right, Des Fief, Len Baggett, the author, Red Martin and Tom Bush. A Corsair's cockpit showing instrument panel with altimeter, compass, artificial horizon and other indicator dials. The throttle box and gun switches for rendering the firing circuits alive are to the left of the cockpit, Imperial War Museum. Corsairs in Illustrious hangar. The narrow clearance between the deckhead and the tips of the folded wings is evident. The 3 small slots in the underside of the wing of the aircraft on the left are vents for ejected ammunition cartridges. Imperial War Museum. 15th Fighter Wing, Spring 1944, left to right, back row, Welpton, Shaw, Barber, Graham Cann, Fullerton, Quigg, Starkey, Richardson, Wing Observer, Millard, Rogers, McLaren, Facer, Buchan, Aitken, Pawson, middle row, Seebeck, Baker, Booth, Munnock, the author, Tritton, Sutton, Cole, Hadman, Brown, Retallick, front row, Brynildson, Clark, Ritchie, Guy. Pilots, chiefs and petty officers of 1833 Squadron, Quonset Point, Rhode Island, 1943. Left to right, back row, CPO Madison, Sub-Lieutenants Brynildson, Starkey, Rogers, Shaw and P.O. Geddes. Left to right, centre row, Sub-Lieutenants Monarch, Baker, Lieutenant Hanson, Lieutenant Commander Monk, Sub-Lieutenants Aitken and Builder. Left to right, front row, P.O.s Edwards, Cousins, Radburn, Turner, Vincent and Clift. Captain of Illustrious, R.L.B. Cunliffe, CBE, R.N., Admiral Mountbatten addresses ship's company. With Rear Admiral Moody, Captain Cunliffe and Commander Wallace, a vivid overhead view of Illustrious. Both of her lifts are in the down position, Imperial War Museum. Corsairs running up for takeoff to Surabaya. Corsairs taking off for Surabaya. Saratoga's strike aircraft forming up. Gordon Aitken returns from Surabaya. John Hastings batting. Note flaps and arrestor hook fully extended. At sea off the northwest coast of Australia. The fleet is in line astern and has just been passed by Saratoga and her attendant destroyers, seen in the right background, bidding farewell to the Eastern Fleet as they set course for California, Imperial War Museum. Pilots of 1833 Squadron at RNAS Cape Town, October 1944. Left to right, front row, Churchill, Baxter, Rogers, Monarch, the author, Parley, James, Morgan, Booth. Back row, Lee, Shaw, Aitken, Buchan, Starkey, Heffer, Ritchie, Ayrton, Baker missing in hospital. Strafing Corsairs ready for takeoff for Palembang, January 24, 1945, Imperial War Museum. Illustrious entering dry dock, Sydney, February 1945. Flight deck activity. Corsairs under maintenance and repair during a rendezvous with the fleet train in the Northwest Pacific, April 1945. The damage to the radar protecting screen on the front of the island was caused by the starboard wing of a kamikaze suicide bomber shot down a day or two earlier. Pilots landed after a sortie against Sakishima, April 1945. Left to right, Baker, Retallick, the author, Parley and Quigg. Captain Charles Lambert in his sea cabin aboard HMS Illustrious, April 1945. Later, Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Charles E. Lambert, GCB, CVO. A sing-song in Illustrious's wardroom, 1945. Resting on piano, with arms folded, from left to right, Buchan, Salmon and Doc Ellison, author at the piano. To his right, sitting in the front row, Pawson, Hastings, Retallick, Cole and Monarch. He opens the throttle steadily up to the stop. It's a sticky, humid morning, and great vortices of vapour fling themselves from the propeller tips. Now the 18 cylinders are developing all of their 2000 GP, and the seat hits him in the small of the back. With no assistance from him, the tail of the aircraft lifts off the runway, and the Corsair is scudding along, faster and ever faster. At about 130 knots, she lifts off effortlessly, and the ground falls away. The pilot closes the hood and raises the undercarriage. The lever is down at his left-hand side, to lessen the drag and build up the climbing speed. He reduces the revs to climbing power, about 2,400 revolutions per minute. Now he can cut the throttle to climbing power, and at long last release the safety harness lock which, whilst still securing him in his seat, allows some freedom of movement. He's really batting along now, soaring up to the virgin whiteness of the great banks of cumulus above him. He climbs through them at 10,000 feet. First stage supercharger is now whining like a great dynamo. He's gone on to oxygen, its sweet taste cold in his mouth. They, this lovely creature and he, level off over the cloud, sailing along on top of the world in magnificent solitude. Below him, the coast of Ceylon stretches away to the south towards Batticaloa. Far away to his right, the mountains can be seen below the clouds. Adams Peak, 8,000 feet of mountain in the centre of the island, is far below him. The Pratt and Whitney is purring like a great cat, cantering along, pushing back the miles at 240 knots indicated. What a day to be alive! He revels in the sheer ecstasy of living. He looks around, underneath, above, nothing. He pushes the stick forwards until the airspeed indicator registers 320 knots. Now back, back, back. He begins to grey out as the forces of G bring on an incipient blackout. The world and the instrument panel become dim and dark. He loses the Earth, now it's all sky. The Corsair pulls over into the inverted position, on top of the loop. He eases the stick. Immediately the Earth brightens up again as his vision clears and he swoops down, building up a tremendous speed as the Earth comes back into view. Now the jungle is fairly rushing up at him. Although he has reduced throttle, the engine is still whining. There is a huge jolt as he flashes through the slipstream of his initial dive, that must have been a good loop, and blacks out slightly as he pulls out of the dive into level flight again. Now into another dive, and the speed builds up massively again. Pull! Pull! Now he's really blacked out. He feels her go into a steep climb and relaxes pressure on the stick. The blood comes rushing back to his eyes. The dragging weight is lifted from his arms, legs, abdomen. He flicks over the stick and goes into a series of upward Charlies, fast rolls in the climbing attitude, until the power ebbs away and he falls off into a stall turn. Now for a couple of chandelles. A dive, a climb, up and up until she's near the stall, then rudder and stick to the left and he slides off, falling through the sky at something like 350 miles an hour.